Okay, so we are now recording. So good afternoon. My name is Jo Stomel, and in the SCA, I'm known as the Honorable Lady Jerusha Alaon, but we're doing this class in the modern context, hence I am not wearing garb. I'm wearing a cat lady t-shirt because I can. So this class is called Embroidery 101, and specifically it's a overview of 8 period stitches. This class is based on a handout written by Mary Jenkins, known in the SCA as Mistress Ealasaid Nihuin. A copy of the handout has been made available via link to Google Drive. If you have, and there was also a supply list if you wanted to follow along. The main focus of this class will be to actually learn the stitches. But before doing that, I do want to kind of go over the handout in more detail. So I will go ahead and copy and paste my contact information once again on the chat. I am on Facebook. You feel free to contact me via email or friend me on Facebook. I also host a bi-monthly art salon on the first and third Saturday of the month from 11 to 1 Pacific time, and there's a link to the event there. Even though this class is being recorded, there is an earlier recording of the class when I taught it at an SCA event, so I included that link there if you need a visual reminder of the classes while this video is being edited and uploaded to the February YouTube channel. A couple of housekeeping notes real quick. I will be using my camera to show you the stitches. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask. I will not be monitoring the chat while the class is going on. And just, we'll just take it from there. So the first thing I'd like to do is go ahead and go over the handout with you. So we're going to be concentrating on the first 4 pages, which is the 8 stitches that we'll be working on with a sampler, the pattern of which was in your supply list. After that, there's a few sections with additional information. First section is some more intermediate type of stitches that you may want to consider practicing on your own. I keep saying to myself that I will develop an Embroidery 102 class based on this information. I keep finding other things to do. So, but if you want to go ahead and take a look at those. The next section of the handout, which I think is the niftiest part, and which is why I continue to use this handout, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is a summary by century. So the majority of us have come here to February because we have an interest in fiber arts and stuff like that. And a good portion of us are also in the SCA. So this section here kind of breaks down the different types of embroideries that were done by century. It gives you what stitches were most common, what fabrics those stitches were done, and what designs were usually done. And it goes from the 4th century all the way through to the 17th century, which is right around the end of SCA period. But now with like TV shows like Bridgerton and stuff like that, we're running more into 17th and 18th century. So
can I interrupt for 1 sec?
Yes.
Just for people who don't know, the SCA is a living history group that recreates and researches the Middle Ages. So whenever she talks about the SCA, it's a historical reenactment group.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm so used to just being around SCA people that I totally forget to explain it. So my apologies. The next section of the handout is an essay by Mary, Mistress Ealasaid, with general tips about basic embroidery. I will make allusions to this section throughout the course, but it's certainly something that I encourage you to read. It is not the be all and end all. Everyone's got a different way of doing things, and some of the things that the way I do things are not the way that Mary does them, but she is a very experienced embroiderer, so I would definitely take a read at that. And then the final section is a bibliography with a list of books and websites that Mary recommends if you want to kind of take your embroidery knowledge up a notch. I do have copies of all of the books listed on this this list, and at the end of class, once we're completed the stitches part, I'll kind of do a little show and tell, show the books and explain them, and let you know how to, in many cases, locate them. Every one of these books is pretty easy to locate. The one that's the most expensive one was about $30. So, you know, if you want to start these are great books to start your embroidery library. My library has gotten quite bigger. That's all embroidery books back there, by the way. But I'm also nuts. So there you go. Okay, so before I continue, do I have any questions? All right, silence indicates consent. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my handy dandy embroidery cam. So one moment while I do that. So this is my hoop with my sampler design on it. It is basically the same design that was on that supply sheet. I'm using a red linen fabric, but as long as you're not using Aida cloth, which is really doesn't really transfer very well for this class, any type of fabric will do. For this class, I'm actually using Dmc Floss, which looks like a floss consists of 6 strands that look like this. They come in 489 colors, and I have just about all of them, so I'm a happy camper. But there's also other, and this is the most common thread that's used in embroidery, even with modern and historical applications, just because it's so easy to find and fairly inexpensive. If you're wanting to do a more historically accurate piece, you would probably be using either silk thread or woolen thread. This particular type of thread here is wool tapestry thread. And it can be used for both regular embroidery, crewel work, which is basically a surface embroidery technique, and others. I also have lots of, basically string is string. So, but for purposes of this class, we're going to be working with the DMC. Now, the DMC floss comes in 6 strands that are kind of tight, not very tightly, but semi-loosely put together. I'm going to bring this up here and focus it a little bit so you can see, that these are the, it's 6 threads. Now they're usually kind of not tightly, but they are kind of spun together. You can use all 6 threads at the same time, and that's what I'll be using here for my sample piece. But if you are wanting to work on a piece, typically the minimum would just be 2 strands. So the technique that I have in order to separate the strands out from a DMC floss hank is I usually take the end of the floss and hold it with my thumb. And then I basically run my fingers all the way down. What this does, it prevents this sort of thing. Like a schmuck, I went ahead and created myself a nice little knot. So, because if you try to remove a strand of floss without smoothing it out to kind of untwist it a little bit, you're basically creating a nice little cat toy, which, considering I have 4 of the little buggers, it's probably, they have plenty of cat toys. They don't need my thread. So you just run your fingers up and down.
Jo?
Yes?
Hi, interrupting, sorry, but would you recommend using beeswax for your cotton and linen and silk threads?
Yeah, I use it all the time too. So sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. In this case, I'm not, because this is just a practice thing. But yeah, I've got more beeswax than I really care to
The
admit.
bees. Thank you.
Yeah. So but even if you're using beeswax, this is what I have found to be the best way to separate strands from any type of thread that has detachable strands. So once you do that, you kind of locate the single one that you want, kind of pull it out from underneath, from everyone else, separate it out and kind of pull it out like that. Make sure it's only one. You don't want to do this with more than one thread at a time, because otherwise you will be creating a cat toy. So once you do that, you place your thumb on the rest of the thread, and then you just pull out the thread. And as you can see, as I'm pulling the thread out, it twirls up behind me, but it twirls up in such a way that it doesn't become a big old honking mess. And then you just take your hands and run it through again, and you have your thread like that. So that's the way I do it. Again, as someone else mentioned already in the class, there's beeswax. There's also commercial products like Thread Magic and others such as that you can use as well to condition your threads prior to using them. Those are totally optional, and it really just depends on the purpose of your work. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and start with our first stitch in the handout, which is stem stitch or outline stitch. This is basically your basic stitch that's been around for millennia. You know, it can be used to either outline a design, or you can use it to fill a design as well. It can handle curves. It's very versatile, and the length of the stitches determines how robust it looks. Also, another factor for the stitch is also how many threads you use. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how to use this, how to do this stitch on one of the curved lines of my. Let's try and make sure I'm not. So basically, to begin, you're just going to pull your needle through and take it out. Now I've got a knot at the end of my thread. Now there's different techniques to ground your thread and all of that, but this is a sampler and something that I'm not going to be mounting on a board or anything, so I don't really care if there's like a knot in the back. And as you can tell, I do have cats in this household, so there's cat hair and everything. And no, Missy, you are not part of the show. All right. So you bring your thread out, and then you're going to bring your needle down, and then this is where you kind of get to decide how long you want your stitch to be. The longer the stitch, the less control you have over a curve. So if you make it really long, then you won't be able to do as many curves. If you do it really small, you can definitely control a tighter curve. For purposes of this class, I'm going to make my stitches a little bit bigger than I normally would, simply because I want to make sure that you guys can see what I'm doing. And just one moment. Sorry, all right, so we're going to bring our needle back down. And by the way, if you want to edit that part out. So we're going to bring our needle down and through until we create a loop, like so. Now, once you've practiced the stitch long enough, you won't need to have this large of a loop. You'll literally just be zipping along. But I want to make sure that you guys can see exactly what I'm doing. Hence, I'm making this loop rather exaggerated. So next, I'm going to bring my needle back up. Now here's another aesthetic choice that you get to make as the embroiderer, where you bring your needle up. Some folks bring it up in the middle. Other folks bring the needle up right next to the first hole there. It really just depends on what effect you're trying to do and how you want it to look. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring my needle up right next to that first section there and pull it through. gonna let me, there we go. And then all the way through. So that's your first stitch. So let me move that up and put it on focus. So that's your first stitch. And then basically in order to continue along, you basically want to follow the line here of the curve. Now, when you're trying to do a curve, where you place your needle, where you place your thread after you push your needle through a second time is going to kind of determine the direction of your curve. So if you choose to leave your needle where the thread is on top of the needle or at the bottom of the needle or below the needle, is an aesthetic decision that you can make to determine how you want your thread to lay along the curve. Personally, I like to have it above my needle just to kind of create that little curve effect. But it really just depends on what you want to do. So, any questions? All right, so I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to practice this stitch on your sampler. And then we will move on to the next one. So I will be working on my stitch here in the camera. And then if there's any questions, feel free to ask. Now I do want to note that here when I'm going into this next curve, which kind of goes under, you can either continue having your needle or your thread to go in the same direction in terms of where the needle is. And I am just not doing too well here with this thread. Apologize. Or you can switch the direction. So what I typically would do here, since we're getting into the other side of this curve, I will adjust the direction of my thread and I will move it so that it follows the curve, as it were. This is entirely optional. It's not something that you have to do. You can continue going in whatever direction you want. But for me personally, I find this to be more aesthetically pleasing. All right, so we'll give you guys one more minute and then we'll move on to the next stitch. By the way, feel free to ask any questions you want. So I'm going to go ahead and prep for my next stitch. Since I'm stopping this and going to be moving on to another stitch, usually what I do to move on is I just run my thread across a couple of the back stitches and snip that off. And then and then I can start my next thread that way as well. So that's how that works. So any questions on stem stitch before we move on to the next stitch? Okay, so next up on our journey here is the split stitch, which is very similar to stem, except instead of going up and around the thread, we actually go through the thread, hence the term split. This stitch can be used as a fill or an outline stitch. Again, it's one of the ancient and honorables, I'd like to say, of the embroidery world. You can, it's been found, it's been around for time immemorial and has been used in just about every time frame, including up to today. So for this stitch, we're actually going to practice on one of the straight lines of our sampler. And I'm going to go ahead and bring my needle up and out like before. And then just like with the stem stitch before, I will bring my needle down. Again, the length of the stitch, I love you too, Kat, but not now. Oh, come on, Inari. Bye. All right, sorry, cat disruption. You'll bring your thread down, and then this time you're not going to create a loop. You're just going to bring your thread all the way down and create your main stitch. Now the handout says that you only want to back up about a third of the previous stitch. But the way I see it is do whatever works for you. If you prefer to go it that way to make it thicker looking, or if you want to go closer to the middle, what matters is that you bring your needle up and it is in between the thread. I have seen this stitch done with a single strand of thread, and if you're going to do it that way, then you definitely want to make sure that your stitches are small, because otherwise you'll snag up your thread. But in my example, I'm just going to bring my thread up right around the middle, pull my needle, and then move over to my and complete my next stitch, like so. And I kind of used the end of the previous stitch as a guide as to where I push my needle through, just to kind of make the stitches look a little bit more even. And as you can see, it kind of creates this little texture that that can be used to, to fill an area, and it's also very good to outline an area. The smaller the stitches, the more pronounced the pattern is. You can't really see it here. You can see it here a little bit, but the smaller the stitches, the more pronounced it is. So do I have any questions? Okay, I'll give you guys another 2 minutes to go ahead and practice your stitch. I'll go ahead and finish out this thread and go to my next color. And once you've done this stitch for a long time, it gets so that you do it fairly quickly. There are even folks that I always try and go a little bit slower just to make sure that my stitches remain as neat as possible. But I've seen people who can do this extremely fast. So, all right, I'm gonna finish off this thread here. And move on to our next color. I prepared this time. I threaded a bunch of needles before the class all right. So if there are no questions, we'll move on to the next stitch in which is extremely easy. So this shouldn't take very long at all. Running and double running stitch is also known as Holbein stitch. It's also, and it's your basic outline stitch. It doesn't really do curves very well. In fact, it doesn't really do them at all. This stitch has been used in various types of embroidery, mostly counted work such as black work. It's also used in the Japanese embroidery of sashiko, which is just outside of SCA period, but that's been that's my latest obsession. So I've been working on sashiko. So, but basically the purpose, this is also a basic sewing type of stitch. You can use this to sew together two pieces of fabric. And I have done that many times. So we're going to practice this stitch on one of the other lines, straight lines. And basically you're just bringing your needle up and down. And the trick with this stitch is to make your stitches as even as possible. And I'm just eyeballing it here because obviously this is not a counted, an even weave or a counted linen. This is just a scrap that I found in my pile. But you can understand how this would be a very useful stitch for geometric patterns and counted work, because you could count the number of threads out to create a pretty accurate line. And so as you go up and down, you'll just continue, kind of like the marks on the road, just up and down. Now this is just the running stitch by itself. To make it a double running stitch, you're basically going back and filling in the gaps right here, which is what I'm going to go ahead and do now. So once you've created your basic running stitch like so, you want to come back the way you came by bringing your needle up and over the gaps that you created with your running stitch. Now, the key to this, and which I will be mangling up badly because I'm not eyeballing it as much as I should, is to try and make sure that you bring your needle up and down as close to the same hole that you had your previous stitch as possible. So you create a solid line, and it looks texturally, complete. So this is where you kind of have to be a little bit more careful about needle placement in terms of making sure that you don't break up the line. So I will finish this off. And then in theory, and see how I kind of messed that up, I forgot, I didn't quite put that stitch right next to the other one. In theory, the front is supposed to look like the back. So you could use this in those type of stitching situations, like when you're making cuffs or something like that, where you want it to look the same in the front as it is in the back. And then there's like, special techniques to wind up the thread, but we're not, this is just practice. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish this off. And then that's your double running stitch, So any questions? Okay, I'll give you guys a minute to kind of wrap up this stitch. It's fairly quickly here. And then we'll move on to the next. We're almost at the halfway point. Woohoo! All right. Okay, so the next stitch we're going to talk about is chain stitch. This is another type of stitch that is used for either outline or fill, and it's called as such because it mimics the chains in in chainmail and things of that nature. It can be used as both an outline and a fill. And then it can also be used combined with satin stitch, which we'll be practicing later on in the class, to kind of create a textured look. So we're going to practice the stitch on our other curved line here. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. And actually, I think I'm going to be crazy here and start on this side. Now. So we're going to bring our thread out, and then we're going to bring it back in on the same hole we came out of. So this is where it kind of gets a little tricky, where you kind of have to, you know, make sure that you're paying attention to where your needle came out and where it comes in, because it doesn't have to be exact, but you want to make sure you get it as close as possible in order to create your loop. Now I'm making this loop a lot bigger than you would normally see, but this is what it should look like. The first part of the stitch, like so. Now here is where you get to make your aesthetic decision, whether or not you want to make your chain stitch thin or fat. And then how long do you want your stitch? Obviously this is a little bit too long for the line that I'm doing, but you can make your stitch as large or as small as you want, depending on your on what you're trying to do. The key is consistency. A good chain stitch, the chains, quote unquote, will look about the same size throughout your stitching. And that's kind of where the practice comes in, to make sure that you're doing that for each of the stitches. So I'm making mine a little bit bigger just so that you guys can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to bring so I've created my little loop, and I'm just using my thumb to kind of lay it down. And then I bring my needle up where I want the loop to stay. So I'm following the line on my sampler. And then I'm going to bring my thread up. Now here's where tensioning is important. I've reached the end of my thread. If I want to keep my chain nice and fat, I just want to stop here. If I want to make my chain thin, then I just pull a little bit more and give it more tension, and that creates a kind of a longer, thinner chain. Once you do that, it's kind of hard to bring it back, because basically you have to go under, kind of what I'm doing here, and kind of loosen the stitch a little bit, bring it up, and then, so that's how you know, if you've made it too tight, this is how you would have to work towards bringing it back to the consistency that you want. So, and then to create your next chain, all you're going to do is you're going to create your next loop by bringing your needle down right next to where it came up. Oops. And create your next loop. Any questions? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and give you guys a couple of minutes to practice this. I'll do a few more on my sample here for you to look at. If you have any questions or need me to repeat something, please let me know, and then we will move on to the next stitch. And we're about halfway through. Huzzah, or hooray, or yay, or whatever you want to call it. Now, no, I do want to point this out. So see, notice how my DMC has my thread has kind of twisted onto itself, and it creates an issue where where it doesn't lay the way you want it to. Specifically with DMC floss, you just want to make sure that every once in a while, and I'm just going to pull this out, every once in a while, you just let your, I'm going to move back over to my regular camera here real quick. So just every once in a while, you want to just, bring your thread down and let it, let it dangle so that it gets rid of any curves. And you depending on how often you're doing, how much you're twisting the thread as you sew, as you embroider, you may have to stop and do that on more than one occasion. Let me go back to the embroidery cam and see. One of the tools that I mentioned in my supply list was a threader. I included a couple of these. This is a DMC Threader. It used to have the little wire on top for the thinner threads, but it got broken off a long time ago. So I usually just use it for these two bigger ones here, which basically is how I can thread my thread fairly quickly without having to, especially in these times of COVID, lick my thread and stuff like that. So any questions, concerns, comments, emotional outbursts? Bueller? Okay, so we'll go ahead and finish this particular thread. Now, if I'm done or if I need to switch out threads, usually what I do is I complete my loop, but instead of creating my next loop, I just tack down the stitch with a small couching stitch like so, and then pick up where I left off. So that's kind of what I'm doing here. All right, so that's chain stitch. Next up on our is surface and underside couching. These were mostly used in conjunction with gold work, which is a technique that was used in medieval times and even to the modern day, where you're basically taking strands of metal thread, let's pretend this is gold, and you're basically couching them down onto a piece of fabric to create, different designs, patterns. This has been used as both a fill, as an outline. Anybody who has seen, the Great Opus Anglicanum, which is the English works, this was done usually with very expensive fabrics and threads. And the point was conspicuous consumption. If you're going to have this big old thread of gold, you want as much of it to show as possible. You're not interested in putting the gold on the back of the thread. So for this stitch, we're going to practice here on this third straight line here. I'm going to go ahead and use this as my pretend gold. So what I usually do is I pull my thread over and then just leave it laying out like so. I'm just going to take this thread off. And basically, if you want, you can, for the purposes of this class, if you want to just make a tie in the back so that way it's not going to go anywhere. Typically, though, you wouldn't do this until after you've completed your couching, but we're going to just practice, so that's not a big of a deal. So here's my gold thread. We're going to be couching it along this line here. Normally, you would use either a similarly colored gold thread. In some cases, a contrasting color was used, such as red. For purposes of this class, so that you guys can see what I'm doing, I'm going to be using this blue thread as the thread that I will actually be couching down my gold, quote unquote, with. So once you've got your thread, the thread that you're going to couch down laid on the fabric, surface couching, you're literally bringing your needle up and then over. And then that's how you tack down. Let me go ahead and bring this up so you guys can see. And you're tacking down the thread to the fabric. So basically up and down. For this technique, you don't, the needle doesn't need to be precise. Up and you don't need to bring the needle up precisely and down precisely anywhere, just as long as it you know, holds down the thread that you want couched down. This also can, the length in between stitches is also up to you. Some people can, especially in later period or Niue, which is something that you guys saw the second part of this handout, they used these threads to create designs within the gold. That's more of a 13th, 14th century technique. But sometimes you really want to just show the gold. You don't want to see the little nubs there. You just want the gold to shine through. And that's what underside couching does. So for underside couching, you want to make, for underside couching, the needle placement is extremely important, because you're basically going to be pulling your couched thread through the fabric very slightly in order to hide the stitch that you made to put it down. So I'm bringing my needle up, and then I need to make sure that, for this it's very important that you bring your needle down exactly where your needle went up. So you may need to wiggle things around a little bit to make sure that you've got enough, you know exactly where you're going. So you're going to bring your needle down like so. And then just like any other you're just going to bring it down like this. Only instead of leaving it on the surface like you normally would, you're going to yank your thread down so that it basically hides the couching thread. If you flip it over, you'll see that just the teeniest bit of the couched thread shows up under there. And that's how you create that smooth texture that just highlights the thread that's being couched, and so that you no longer see the couching thread. So I'll do that one more time. So you bring your needle up, and sometimes it might be easier if you, as you bring your needle up, you move it around a little bit just to make the hole a little bit bigger for you to ensure that you're bringing the needle back down directly into the same hole. Bring your stitch down, straighten out your couching thread, and then pull it slightly, and there's your stitch. Any questions?
I like that one.
Yeah, especially if you're doing gold work and things of that nature. This is a great way to basically make your gold shine. You know what I'm saying? So that's once you get into later period, this technique isn't used as much because, quite frankly, the Black Death basically is what destroyed Opus Anglicanum in England. When, you know, over half of your population dies, you know, a lot of knowledge gets taken with them. So that's how that works. So I will give you guys a couple of minutes to practice your couching. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them. And then we will move on to the next stitch. That's going to be a surface. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and prep for my next stitch here. So And just as a little bonus technique here, this technique, which is not really a technique, but what I'm doing here is called the plunging. This is where you take the thread once you've done your embroidery on it, and you just push it through to basically complete the process. Okay. All right, so the next stitch we're going to talk about is brick stitch / long and short stitch. So this is where we're going to start working on the little squares and the circle at the top of the of the sampler here. Brick stitch and the difference between brick stitch and long and short stitch is, in essence, the geometry of it. So the geometry of the brick stitch is that it's very much a counted stitch. You want to create that look of a brick wall. With long and short, it's more fluid. It's more, you know, kind of like you go here, you go there. Some stitches are long, some are short, but the idea is that it's not as structured as brick stitch. And you can see that in the illustrations in your handout, the difference structurally between brick stitch and then long and short. For purposes of this class, I'm going to be teaching the kind of more traditional brick stitch type in theory. But by the time I'm finished demonstrating it, it'll probably look more like long and short, because obviously I'm not counting threads here. I'm just kind of eyeballing it. So to begin.
Joanna,
Yes?
real quick, I'm going to return hosting to you.
Okay.
Have fun.
Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start here in we're going to use one of our squares here. Now, the brick stitch is generally the only time you're doing actually long and short stitches in brick stitch, or long and short, is either at the beginning and at the end. So you establish your brick, as it were, and I'm being very technical here, by basically doing a series of stitches in a row, alternating between long, which is what this stitch is, and then moving and then bringing your next stitch right next to where you went and making it short. So now keep in mind, you know, this would normally be done on some sort of even weave, and you would be counting the stitches to make the lines as even as possible. But I'm kind of eyeballing it here so that, you know, we're not here for 4 hours, because I don't know about you, but I still got to go grocery shopping. So basically you're going to go through your first row by doing the long and short stitch. So any questions? And see how I'm kind of already creating a gap here, and it's not very pretty looking. With long and short stitch, I could go back and fix that later with kind of cleanup stitches. If this were like a true brick stitch that I was doing here, I would pull it out and do it again. So, and see, that one I think I'm going to pull out because that was just a bad angle. Whoop. So I'm going to stop here at the halfway point. You guys can feel, I'm going to go ahead and finish this row here, excuse me. don't know why I said that. So I'm going to kind of speed up my stitching here. This is one of those stitches that requires a lot of practice. I will freely admit that this is not my, this is not the stitch that I know the most about or that I can do as well as others. But it is very useful, especially when you are making, when you're embroidering animals. It does create the visual texture of feathers and scales fur very well. Especially if you're using the long and short. In the modern day here, this technique is also known as thread painting. And there are some people who can do this with just one strand of silk, and I think they're nuts. All right, so I've created my long and short row. So let's pretend it's all nice and pretty. Like that. So you notice that we have long stitch, long stitch, short stitch, etc. I'm going to go ahead and change colors so that you can see better what the effect is supposed to be. So the idea is, now that you've kind of established this brick-like pattern, or via the stitches here where you can see kind of like the gaps, the stitches that you're going to do now are all going to be the same size, but because you're going to be starting at different parts, at different parts, it's going to mimic the appearance of them being also long and short as well. And it also, so just so that you're seeing what I'm doing here, I'm going to do my first stitch, and it's going to be about the same size, but because of where I'm positioning the stitch in relation to the first row, it's going to give you that effect of brickwork, or that, or if this, or if we're using long and short stitch, it's going to give you that kind of feathering effect. So, any questions? All right. Well, I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to continue working on this stitch. I'm going to finish off this thread here, and then we can move on to the next stitch. All right, so the next stitch we're going to work on we're almost done, is Satin Stitch, which is usually reserved for the modern practice nowadays is to use Satin Stitch on very large areas. But generally speaking, Satin Stitch is typically used in smaller areas of a design, but you know, your mileage may vary. For the purposes of this class, we're going to be using the circle design here in the middle to practice our Satin Stitch. Now, if you see in the handout, the diagram shows you starting at the end and then working your way across. And that is certainly a valid way of doing Satin Stitch. I, however, tend to start at the middle and work out. Also, if you notice the stitch diagram next to it shows how you can use Satin Stitch in combination with chain stitch to create a raised effect on your on your stitch by going in one direction, doing the chain stitch in one direction and then doing the stem stitch in the other to create texture. The diagram shows a chain stitch, but I've also seen this done with just straight stitches as well. Either way, it just depends on what you want to do. For purposes of this class, I'm just going to show the plain Satin Stitch. And really, the idea behind Satin Stitch is basically to cover the area as neatly and evenly as possible. So I'm using wool thread for this particular stitch, just to kind of show you, so that you can see how it lays a little bit better. So basically, I begin by making my stitch at the widest part of the circle. Well, widest-ish. I mean, I'm not quite in the middle, but you get the idea. And the idea is to follow the outline, and you want to usually bring your needle just outside of the outline so that you cover it. Some folks can do a stem stitch around to kind of hide any imperfections, but that's really up to you. And you're basically going up and down, following the shape, the outline of the shape. And the idea is to have your threads line up so that they're right next to each other and kind of create that quote unquote satin look to the object that you're stitching. So, and then once you've reached the end and have done your last stitch on the end, you basically go back up here and work from the middle back out to the other side. Any questions? So if you notice, my fabric has kind of puckered up a little bit. So that's one of the things that you want to be careful with when you're doing satin stitch. You want to make sure that your tension is such that it's not puckering up your fabric. Another option is to just simply use, you know, either a scroll frame or a slate frame. But you know, we work with what we got. Just so you guys can see, in theory, the back of the work should look just about like the front of the work. And as you can see, this actually wastes a lot of thread. So a lot of that's why satin stitch was used very sparingly and only on small motifs, because in the historical past, thread was expensive, especially your silks and stuff like that. And this was considered a waste because it wasn't being seen. by the person, by the general public. So, but nowadays, obviously, that's not a big of a deal, and you just kind of any questions? I feel like I'm just doing a temperature check. Everyone doing good? You guys are understanding what I'm saying? You guys are, there's people here, right?
Yep.
Okay, just checking.
You're not
Thank
alone.
you.
Perfect sense.
Okay, so there's your satin stitch right there. I'm going to go ahead and get ready for our final stitch, which is the Bayou Stitch, also known as laid work. It basically combines the technique that you saw in couching, but does it in a much more, what you would say, a quicker way that makes it so that it works a little bit faster than traditional underside or surface couching. If you look at the diagrams, there are two different, there's a diagram showing how you set up the what I'm going to call the horizontal. Sometimes it's the vertical, it just depends on, or the diagonal, it just depends on what you're doing. And the purpose of the stitch was also to avoid, to preserve thread and make it so that the most of the thread comes up to the front of the fabric and you're not wasting thread in the back. So I'm going to use this other circle, the final circle here, to kind of start my my laid work here. And I'm going to basically do a zigzag from one end of my square to the other. So we're going to start on this end here. Now with thread this thick, I don't really need to do the zigzag method. I'm just going to kind of, park my thread right next to it, or maybe I will. I don't know. It depends. But the point is for the fabric to be covered. So this is one of those situations where you all, again, want to pay attention to your tension, making sure that you're not stretching your thread so much that it puckers up the fabric underneath, because the way that you're setting up this thread is so that the maximum amount of thread is shown on the surface, and you are not, there's not as much thread in the back. So just to kind of show you what that looks like, if you turn around, you'll notice how little thread is in the back of your stitching. And that's on purpose, because you want, you paid good money for this thread. You want it to be in the front of your in the front of your piece. So I'm going to go ahead and finish what I'm doing here and create my area. And then, now normally I would go back, and I will for a couple, just one until I run out of thread, and fill in those gaps. Because again, the idea is for there not to be any thread showing. Now, obviously, this is not perfect, but it should kind of give you a rough idea of what this should look like. So normally this would be across a much wider selection of fabric. Obviously, since this is a sampler, in theory, you could just leave this alone and you're fine. It's not going to, like, go all over the place. But the second part of this is the actual couching down using the opposite direction. So I'm going to go ahead and tie this off. And as you can see, once again, you're not using that. The point of this stitch is to make sure as much of the thread as possible is in the front of the piece. And wouldn't you know, I'm out of. So I get to roll out some white because I want to use a contrasting color. Now, most of the time, if you look at the Bayou Tapestry, the stitches were all done in the same color so that you really didn't see the contrast. It was more of a textural thing. But because I want to kind of show you how things look, I am doing the opposite here and doing the second part in a contrasting color so that you guys can see what I'm doing. And eventually this will come through. Come on. There we go. Mhm. All right, so we've got our couching thread here. So basically, we're going to, if you look at the diagram in the handout, we're going to bring our needle up on the opposite end and over all of the threads that we just did. To kind of create a kind of a little over, like a major couching there. And then you're going to basically come back up and tack down that thread over. And here's where you can kind of get creative in terms of, you know, the placement of these couching stitches, you know, determining if you want to create like a pattern or you know, the way the stitches or the length of the stitches, et cetera, you know, that's up to you as the embroiderer. The key with these couching stitches is you want to try and make sure as much as possible to not make it so that the stitches come through and separate out the threads that you did. Like you see that there's one of those that kind of went through. And then you just basically do another one again, like so. And that is laid work. Any questions?
Not a question, but a comment.
Mhm.
I have struggled for years to get that to work without the threads just coming back up.
Mhm.
It never occurred to me to work in a Z pattern like that.
Mhm.
That solves so many problems. Thank you.
You know, and that's the cool thing, you know, with these classes, which I always take beginner classes, even though you couldn't, I'm not really much of a beginner anymore. I always like taking the beginner classes because the techniques that you learn are, everybody does things slightly differently. And one of the coolest things about embroidery to me is that it's, you know, it's very much, even though there are rules and, you know, and instructions and different types of stitches, you can make so many decisions within that structure to create, you know, to create texture, to create lines, and make it truly into your own artistic form of expression. That's just, you know, That's my soapbox and I'm stepping off of it. So this is your sampler, hooray. For those of you who followed along using the sampler, you can take the time to complete the stitches. I'm gonna go ahead and move into my regular. Now I always block 2 hours for this class because sometimes I get a lot of questions, other times I don't. This particular session has been pretty quick because most people didn't seem to have any questions about what I was doing. So I'm going to go ahead and take these a few minutes to kind of show you the books that are listed in that bibliography. If you go to the last page of the handout, Mary has a listed of suggested reading. And one of the things that I did once I started teaching this class, with her permission, I have her full permission to use the handout and everything. I made it my goal to purchase every book in that list and take it with me when I taught the class out in public, you know, in person, so that people could actually see the books and, you know, and check them out. So I just want to kind of show them to you really quickly. So let me grab my little pile of books over here. Oh, I woke up the cat. Woo. All right, so the first book, and this one was the most expensive one when I bought it. This is the most expensive one. This one cost me like 30 bucks. But this one is The Art of Embroidery by Lantos Singe. He was he was one of the people at the Royal School of Needlework. I don't think he's around anymore. He may not even be in this planet. But this book is chocked. It does go. It has a small section on SCA period embroidery. And actually, let me bring my. Actually, you know what? I have a much better camera. So let me do this again. So if you, all right. So if you see here, there's the sections here. There is a section here on medieval embroidery and whatnot. You know, it kind of goes over the various types of embroidery, but it's also got a really nice section on world embroidery and embroidery after SCA period. So very comprehensive, very hefty, but it does have a lot of knowledge and information. And this book may have gotten a little bit more expensive since I bought it. Mumble years ago. But if you can find it, I would definitely recommend it. And can you guys see it okay? Do I need to flip the camera around?
Nope, that's good.
Okay, perfect. So that's that one. This one is from the Victoria and Albert Museum, which, you know, one day I will go there and spend all day, every day in there. They'll have to kick me out every night. This is a much more truncated book. It's not as big, you know, and it just basically goes through a particular time and place, Britain from 1200 to 1750. And it's got a lot of color pictures. This, of course, is the Bostock Sampler, one of the first surviving examples of the sampler, and it's from, oh gosh, it's dated 1598. So, so it's got a lot of color pictures and a lot of inspiration, as you can see, with the various types of embroidery. A lot of the surviving extant pieces are all of a religious nature because, well, that's what survived. Most folks who wore embroidery in their clothing, secular embroidery, wasn't really a thing. And since people literally wore their clothes until it fell off, there's not a lot of secular examples left available prior to the Elizabethan and Jacobean era, when it became more prevalent to have secular embroidery. Thank you, Protestant Reformation. So that's that one. Now, if you're interested in the history of embroidery, this is where Mary got her got her overview of embroidery and its different types of times and histories. So this book is definitely a must-have if you're interested in kind of learning more of the historical aspects of embroidery, you know, times, dates, places, this sort of thing. And so there's not a lot of color here, but there's a lot of information. And the bibliography is to die for. I've actually gotten a lot of my library includes books listed in this bibliography. So that's that one. A Guide to English Embroidery. This is another V&A special, as I like to call them. This one is black and white, but it has it's just another overview of English style embroidery, and just it's got just more info. It's about the same as the other one, but maybe a little bit more information. If you're interested in the profession of embroiderers, which is one of the things that I'm interested in, this is a great starting point to learn about the business of embroidery. Because even though, you know, starting in the 17th and going through the 18th, it was seen as a domestic art done by women in the home, that was not the case during the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. This was a profession. There is still an actual embroiderers guild in England, and we would have a lot more information on them and a lot more extant pieces if it wasn't for the fact that their guild hall got bombed down in World War II. I cry myself to sleep at night over it. But anyway, this book will help you really understand the business aspect of it. And it also has lots of cool pictures and things of that nature. And then finally, this, she didn't mention this at all in her handout, but she included it in her bibliography. This is, in essence, period cross stitch. It's also, a CC embroidery is also known as voided work. It is, for those of you who play SCA, it is an entirely period way to do cross stitch. And it is, and it's something that was used very much in the secular world. This type of embroidery was used on table linens, bed linens, and of the like. So if you're wanting to do something, you know, to pretty up your bed sheets, this is what you did back in Italy. So this was in her library, and I picked it up, and I have done a couple of voided work pieces since then. And I think it's something that is really something that should be explored more in terms of, you know, competition and whatnot. So,
Joe, I have a question.
yes.
Is the Italian cross stitch similar to the Hardanger, where they leave holes and stuff like that in their work?
No, this is not pulled thread. This is counted work.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's pulled thread. So
Thank you.
that's about it, cats and kittens. Thank you so much for joining me today in my class. I know that I said 2 hours, but I've run out of things to say, so I don't want to keep you guys if I don't have to. Any final questions before I turn off the recording?
Can you publish in the Fibrary page the list of books you just showed? Because
Yeah,
those are amazing.
Yeah, it's in the last page of the handout. So
Perfect,
if you have the handout, you've got the books. So all of the books that I bought, I got those off of Amazon. If you type in the title, you'll be able to pull them right up. Like I said, most of them were relatively inexpensive. I think the most I paid was $30, and that was for the Lantos Singe book. Prices may have gone up because I think I bought these back in, like, I want to say 2016, 2015, 2016, give or take. So, you know, inflation may vary. But if you're wanting to start your library, that's a good place to start. And then, of course, you can also be crazy like me and end up having 2 bookshelves full of the stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.